Gaijin Goombah's been featured twice on this channel now, once to deal with his talk on Nobushi, and again to talk about the shinobi. But today, we're not talking about Japan or For Honor, where he's concerned. Today I want to address a different video he made entirely. Today we're looking at Goombah's video talking about the anime Goblin Slayer. This seems a little odd to talk about, I know, but his video kind of annoyed me, so let's dive right in. As always, I hold no ill will towards Goombah, and I don't want anyone harassing them for this either. Be respectful and honorable.
Hey everyone, Gaijin Goombah here. Okay, Fall Anime 2018, we need to have a talk. I can begrudgingly swallow the massive saturation of Western fantasy and MMO anime that seems to be the only cool thing right now. Hell, even Gegege no Kitaro's guilty of this.
You can begrudgingly accept this. What, is there a standard now for what Japanese anime is allowed to release or allowed to be popular? Oh, you pesky anime producers, you know better than to break from the norm of Japanese culture. Stick to what you know, Japan. Don't start dipping into cultural appropriation. Nah, I know I'm being too mean to this, but again, the fact you find any issue at all with this is startling. What's wrong with Goblin Slayer, Black Clover, That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, Recovery of an MMO Junkie, one of my favorites by the way, or Sword Art Online? Okay, scratch that last one, there's a lot wrong with that one. But regardless, there's nothing wrong with Japan releasing those, or the fact that they're popular.
But anime, you got a really bizarre obsession with goblins all of a sudden, and it's kinda scaring me.
What? Why? Goblins are awesome! They've got some of the deepest lore when it comes to English, Scottish, even Germany's folk culture. That's right, folks, today's video isn't about Japan. Blasphemy, I know.
Yeah, but I mean, look at this!
What, Goblin Slayer episode 1? Yeah, I didn't get that outrage. You guys know Berserk had a freaking horse in it, right?
No, I mean the sheer amount of goblin prominence when it comes to this season of anime. Sure, there's Goblin Slayer, which has a pretty bleak outlook to the creatures, but then you got That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime.
Wait, when was that?
No, that's the name of the show.
Oh, weird.
In the case of Tensura, hey, that's what Japan's abbreviating it as, the goblins are almost a freaking polar opposite to good old Goblin Slayer, transforming the chaotic freaks of nature into a tribe of ragtag chaotic good humanoids with massive... Yeah. And then finally there's Overlord, which, more like Overload. Seriously, in all of my years of playing tabletop and RPG games, I have never once seen this many goblin types in one place. You got drummer goblins, tank goblins, paladin goblins, ranger goblins, archer goblins, support and attack mage goblins, and god dang ninja goblins.
So, what's the problem?
Too many goblins!
Okay, so how is this a problem? I don't understand what it is about goblins in anime that triggers you. I mean, yeah, okay, Overlord has a lot of goblins, and That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime has a lot of goblins too. Goblin Slayer certainly has a lot of goblins. But want to know what they all have in common? They're all heavily inspired by Western fantasy D&D style games. Hell, Goblin Slayer is so heavily dedicated to the inspiration that each episode begins and ends with the sound of dice being rolled, and none of the characters even have names, just classes. Since goblins are a common presence in these kind of game worlds, it makes sense that they'd have a large presence in these anime. maybe next time I watch Naruto I should scream, "Too many ninjas!"
To be more specific, each of these shows holds goblins, tons of goblins, in very distinctive lights. Where on one hand, goblins are something that should be feared, hated, and eradicated, and on the other... This gave me both pause and contemplation. Just what in the holy blue blazes are goblins? Not these MMO fodder, I mean the core of goblin from folklore. Which of these anime are doing it right, and which are doing it wrong?
You've already shot your whole video premise in the foot here. You just said that all of these shows display goblins in a distinct light, and now you're going to dismantle the MMO aspect to these characters, as in remove any ounce of connection they have to D&D or MMORPG style inspirations they were based on, and demand they all be held to a cultural scrutiny. I'll walk down this road with you, but it should be stated, you're already going the wrong way. Firstly, you want to know what goblins are. Okay, well, let's discuss that. Let's look at the word first. You're correct that the modern translation means ugly fairy or ugly elf, but it is believed that it derived from the Greek word kabalos, which means rogue or evil spirit. It's from the same word we get the creatures kobold, which some people connect to goblins. But leaving that aside, they are generally defined as mischievous, hideous, and frightening creatures from European folklore. Some can be benevolent, but most are at best prankers and at worst malevolent. They were highly popularized in J.R.R. Tolkien's work, and thus the image of them as green and murderous monsters stuck. Thus, different fantasy role-playing games, such as D&D and others, have chosen to portray the goblins as such creatures. Secondly, asking for the cultural accurate truth about goblins depends heavily on the culture you're looking at. Different European cultures have different interpretations of what goblins were like. It's like comparing demons in Japanese folklore with demons in Western lore. There's going to be obvious differences. Or comparing the mermaids of Europe with the sirens of Greece. Distinct differences. So, what culture are you going to be drawing goblins from?
I mean, are goblins actually good? Are they actually evil? I mean, lordy, they sure look evil.
Hey, you best watch yourself there, buddy. I get the fact that goblin literally means ugly fairy, but the general fantasy public loves to put labels on these little guys, such as greedy, murderous, and hateful. Pish posh, I say.
Oh, well, may I direct that pish-posh to J.R.R. Tolkien, the man who ingrained this goblin stereotype into the modern context? Or would you like to say it to his face?
As one of the most common goblin stories in existence is about a benevolent goblin. In fact, that's the frickin' name of the tale. Gesta Romanorum's story tells of a hillock in the middle of a dense forest in England where many a knight and retainer would become exhausted from travel to a point that they would exclaim, "I thirst!" And to their amazement, they would see scrambling through the bush and stone a goblin wearing a crimson cowl, a cheerful countenance, and holding in his hand a gem-encrusted drink horn filled with an unknown but unrivaled beverage, which the goblin would present to the thirsty knight. Heck, he'd even offer the parched guy a silk napkin to wipe their mustaches and beards. But there was one knight, a selfish knight, who traveled to the hillock and shouted, "I thirst," and like clockwork, the goblin came. However, after partaking of the horn, the knight tied it to his belt and ran off, publicly boasting about his deed. However, when his lord found out, he had the knight imprisoned and the horn sent to the king, who kept it in antiquity. But never again did the benevolent goblin return to the hillock.
You know what I find so funny here? You're trying to defend goblins, all goblins, as being generally good, so you use the story title, The Benevolent Goblin. If all goblins are benevolent, why the added title? Isn't that like saying the water-breathing fish? If all goblins are good, why specify this one as being good?
Uh-huh. Tell that to the folks at the borders who have their own well-known goblin that they'd like to introduce. The Redcaps. Described as resembling, quote, short, thick-set old men with long teeth, skinny fingers, and talons like eagles. The last thing a Redcap is going to offer you is a drink. If nothing else, it's going to take a drink of you when it soaks its hat in your blood. Thus the namesake. But that's not all. These extremely evil creatures also don iron boots and wield long, sharp pike staffs that act as their preferred murder tool. And murder often they did. See, in a twisted sense, they kinda had to. For whatever reason, if they didn't have fresh blood on their hats all the time, they would cease to exist. Lucky for them, the border disputes between Scotland and England alone provide enough blood for the Redcaps to keep their hats from getting stiff. But they also weren't afraid of doing their own dirty work. Redcaps were said to hold up in all kinds of rundown fortifications, checkpoints, towers, even castles like the Hermitage Castle where local legend Robin Redcap is said to dwell, laying in wait for any mortal, be it vagabond wanderers seeking shelter or over-adventurous explorers, to step in their domain where they make sure work of the intruder with rocks in their pikes. And in Overlord, whew, they live up to that legend, a little too well in fact. Boasting to be an elite corps of 13 Redcaps and showing off their bloody effectiveness with their polearms. All in all, seems pretty evil to me, bud.
Again, this is one interpretation taken from a different culture. I'm amazed you're not already seeing the problems here. Let me try breaking it down a little easier. Why aren't you arguing which is more accurate, the benevolent goblin story or the Redcap myth? Why are you not saying that one is wrong and the other right? Well, obviously because both are totally valid means of defining goblins. It is at the discretion of the storyteller or culture to determine what goblins mean to them, not yours. Why can't the same be said for Goblin Slayer or Overlord? Let them interpret the goblins the way their story dictates.
Oh please, if I had hands I'd be cracking my knuckles right now because I've only just begun to fight. Let's talk brownies. No, not those, these guys. Unlike their Redcap cousins, brownies come out at night while their homeowners are asleep and do various chores for them such as sweeping, scrubbing, or even farming jobs. And all they ask in return is a bowl of cream, milk, or some other simple luxury. Just don't give them any clothes. Like, ever. You might feel pity for him should you ever glance at their naked or rag-covered bodies, but brownies take gifts of clothes as an insult and will immediately abandon the house.
Wait, are you talking about Dobby from...
Shh, don't get ahead of me. That is if you haven't already laughed at or insulted them. At best, they'll wreck up your place before leaving, and at worst, they'll turn into boggarts. But all in all, brownie goblins are good-natured and incredibly helpful, asking for little more than scraps in return. They may still be as ugly as any other goblin with their dark, wrinkly, shaggy bodies, but brownies got your back, because not only do they do a ton of legwork for the house, but they'll also punish any lazy servants by pranking them until they get back to work. So ha! 2-1, buddy boy. Told you goblins weren't evil.
Except the goddamn redcaps that you literally just mentioned earlier. Did you just miss that? Did you just miss that? You're using exceptions to define a rule. And now the brownie thing. Okay, but are they really goblins? From research I've gathered, while they can be considered goblins, they're more readily classified as fairies or spirits. The word goblin is just so nebulous. It's questionable what should or could be classified as a goblin and what shouldn't. Let's assume for the sake of argument that brownies are goblins and should be treated as such. Okay, fine. But poodles and wolves are still cut from the same species. Because a poodle is domesticated does not mean the wolf can't be dangerous. Besides, you even point out that brownies could be mischievous and might become hostile if insulted or laughed at. That certainly sounds like a sweet little pixie to me. But what I think is hilariously funny about all of this is that there's apparently this folklore about creepy old withered people helping with chores around the house and freaking out when offered clothes. Was that just a thing in Europe for a while? A naked little old man offering to do chores for random people, and people started thinking he was a goblin, not a deranged homeless person.
Oh, you want evil? You want the most horrifying goblin folklores ever spawned? Well then, come with me to the Greenlands of Germany and let me tell you a tale of the Earl King, whom the Oxford Dictionary defines as, quote, a bearded giant or goblin who lures little children to the land of death.
Earl King, Earl King. Isn't that an old Scandinavian word meaning king of elves?
It is, but remember, like you said, the term goblin means little more than ugly elf, so based on their taxonomy, goblins and elves are almost the same thing in this context.
Sure, fine, whatever.
But anyway, the Earl King is actually a legendary poem written by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, which has been put to music several times, with the most famous musical adaptation being a piano accompaniment by Franz Schubert. The story begins deep in the woods late at night. The wind is howling viciously, the fog's getting kicked up all around. A lone rider on horseback is carrying his young son through the dark and tangled forest. The boy, anxious and paranoid of what might be hiding in the darkness, exclaims that the Earl King is right next to them. And all the while, the Earl King is whispering temptations to the boy, promising him gifts, games, even his own daughters to him, if only the boy would go with him. Over and over, the boy tells his father that the Earl King is chasing him, to which the father replies that it's only the wind, only the trees, and only the fog. Growing weary of waiting, the Earl King advances on the boy as he exclaims, my father, he seized me fast, for sorely the Earl King has hurt me at last. The father pushes his horse faster and faster, but by the time they come back to his farm, it's too late. His child dangles limply, dead in his arms.
That's it?
Hey, you may laugh, but this story is one of the great legends that kept kids awake at night. A goblin king coming to take them in the shadows at night? For the 1700s, that was pretty heckin' scary. And the Earl King's legacy has continued even to this day with modern interpretations of the tale from authors like Angela Carter and John Connolly. So, I don't know about you, bud, but this little folktale doesn't exactly give goblins a shining track record.
Well, yeah, it doesn't give this goblin a shining track record. This is to me as the benevolent goblin was, a single example of a single goblin from an entirely different culture. Remember, you jump from England to Germany, there's going to be a difference of interpretation.
Oh, really? Because I know of one goblin type in particular that are mentioned in each of these series that will finally put an end to this greenskin slander. Hobgoblin. Taken from an Old English word meaning he who is of the country, hobgoblins are anything but shrimpy, stout, murderous creatures like so much of fantasy plays them out to be. Were they hyper-evolved goblins who cranked out waifu material faster than Nitro Plus? Well, no, but they were believed to be the child of a goblin and a purebred elf and just as benevolent. In fact, much like brownies, hobgoblins were also faithful for hire who took care of day-to-day chores during the night such as dusting, sweeping, and ironing, needing little in return except food. And just like brownies, if you offer them clothes, they'll exile themselves from the house due to either being insulted by the gesture or just too proud to wear new clothes. But unlike the brownies who focus on their work, hobgoblins are more predominantly pranksters capable of shapeshifting. Like Puck. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that one, huh? Puck, aka Robin Goodfellow from Midsummer's Night Dream, is himself a hobgoblin. Constantly pulling pranks, but never going too far. So how about that, Goblin Slayer? You really gonna kill our homeboy Puck?
Well, no, because Puck isn't in Goblin Slayer. I do find this quite amusing though. I thought this video was intended to decide which anime was getting goblins more accurately, and now it's turned into why Goblin Slayer is bad at understanding goblins. Again, you're neglecting to bear in mind the difference in culture and the fact that brownies and hobgoblins are likely taken from the same folklore, just named differently. So it's very likely you defended your point with the same evidence, just renamed. I mean, you said that the brownies and hobgoblins are almost exactly the same except for the fact that hobgoblins are a little bit more mischievous. Well, what's to say that these aren't just the same creatures, just from a different story or from a different context? But let's go a bit further. I want to see if he does what I think he will.
But Puck isn't the only literary famous goblin. Harry Potter's very own Dobby, by name, is another term for a hobgoblin taken from Lancashire or Yorkshire. Though Dobby are seen as a bit more troublesome with their pranks, sometimes being so troublesome that they'll force people to move. But Dobby ain't no slouch. They'll work just as hard and be just as helpful as any other hobgoblin or brownie. Creating the expression, Master Dobbs has been helping you, when one seems to get more done than they thought. And there's even rumor of a greater Yorkshire Dobby who could cure children of whooping cough. So again, Goblin Slayer, you really gonna murder good old Dobby?
Yeah, sure. Why not? Rowling had no problem doing it for a good bit of tear-jerking that never was. Why not Goblin Slayer? Turn it over to a professional, but I digress.
And this isn't even taking into account other named benevolent hobgoblins such as Robin Roundcap and Blue Birches. And again, going back to our 3 anime in question, hobgoblins exist in all of these universes. In Overlord, you've got Agu, a hobgoblin more intelligent, gentle, and collected than his goblin brethren.
But not a small impish creature that helps clean up around the house, pulls mischievous pranks, or anything you mentioned before. Okay,
Then there's the entirety of Rimuru's goblin clan, which had evolved into hobgoblins and goblinas, all of which were highly intelligent and absolutely okay with never harming humans.
But not a small impish creature that helps clean up around your house while pulling mischievous pranks, possibly forcing you to move as you mentioned before. Yeah, okay, go on.
Then finally, there's the infamous episode 1 of Goblin Slayer, where our titular main character calls out a hobgoblin in the main camp of disgusting green backstabbers. One of these things is not like the other, one of these things just doesn't belong. Not only are the Hobs and Goblin Slayer contrary to the hobgoblins of Overlord and Tensura, but they're contrary to the very folklore they come from.
Well, by Jove, Holmes, I'd say you've cracked the case. Clearly, Goblin Slayer does not depict hobgoblins accurately. But neither do the other two. You started this video by saying you wanted to know who was portraying goblins accurately and who wasn't. Well, that's not what you did. You basically turned this into an attack on Goblin Slayer for making goblins evil in that story. Why, though? Why not point out that anime consistently seems to get goblins wrong from a cultural perspective? Why not point out that Tolkien himself was wrong about them? Why not point out that D&D was wrong about them? Why not point out every single tabletop game or RPG that dares to say goblins are evil? Why just Goblin Slayer? And why are you ignoring the fact that these other 2 anime, even though they make goblins benevolent, do not get them accurately? A much better idea for this video would have been to address all 3 shows and discuss what each got right and wrong based on different folklore. Discuss how the goblins in Goblin Slayer could be like Redcaps or the Earl King. Point out how the friendly goblins in That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime could be inspired by brownies or Dobby. But no, you chose to attack Goblin Slayer. And I do wonder why. But I'll save my tinfoil hat theories for the end.
Well, I guess 3 out of 5 goblins agree. Though there are a handful of malicious, murderous midget greenskins, there are far more goblins in folklore that are beneficial to humanity rather than not.
Yeah, so excuse me, Goblin Slayer, but hashtag not all goblins.
Oh my god, the cringe. Okay, but it does go into my tinfoil hat theory. Again, I'll save that for the end of the video, but let me just point this out. You are now deliberately using this video to dismantle Goblin Slayer, to make it look inaccurate and cruel to goblins, which you say are far more beneficial to humanity than wicked. You say this while only pointing out 3 examples, one being a specific example, and 2 others arguably being the exact same thing, just differently named. You also completely ignore the Tolkien-esque inspirations, the boggarts you mentioned, as well as the kobolds, orcs, and other iterations of goblins that exist. You didn't go over all existing stories and folklore for goblins. You didn't go outside the realm of Europe to talk about other goblins around the world, because there are other ideals of goblins. You cherry-picked ones that could possibly suit this narrative. Again, you looked at 5 examples of goblins, not all examples of goblins. Not a fair or accurate interpretation.
Hard to find a good goblin? Hardly! There's good goblins quite literally everywhere in the British Isles, the location I assume the majority of these animes are supposed to take place in or take after.
No. No. They are not meant to take from Britain or the British Isles. They are inspired by D&D and Tolkien. Want to know how I know that? Particularly for Goblin Slayer? The entire story is built to be a caricature and mocking representation of those kind of D&D tabletop games. The story talks about the world being decided by the roll of the dice, much like players of a tabletop game. All the characters have titles or classes rather than names, much like a tabletop game, and the only one who has an unusual title is Goblin Slayer. As it's constantly pointed out, he resists fate and chooses his own path. In no way did the creators of this show intend to base any of this off of the British Isles. They were clearly looking at tabletop games and hoping to use the idea there to create something creative.
Well, admittedly, Anglo-European culture isn't exactly our strong suit, but I gotta agree. For as much as we tend to put them in a negative light in fantasy, tabletop, and even anime, it seems, goblins are actually pretty good folk. They may prank a bro from time to time, but only a few of them seem to be really chaotic evil to the point of mindless murder. But hey, if you don't believe us, you can come to your own conclusions by watching all 3 of these anime for yourself over on Verve.
Okay, now he goes into his advertiser plug. Okay, but what he said there is very telling. We can draw our own conclusions by watching these 3 anime. No. That's not how I want to learn about goblins. While some of you might have done your research from a quick wiki search, I think it's far more engaging to look at these creatures from multiple lenses and different interpretations. There are 3 things I want to stress here before ending the video. Number 1, can we just say that you were dishonest about the premise of this video? You opened it up by saying you wanted to know which anime got goblin culture correct, and instead used it as a means to attack Goblin Slayer without ever acknowledging that the other 2 anime weren't accurate either. You focused only on the maliciousness of goblins, not the nature of them. Even if the goblins of the other 2 anime are benevolent, they are not helpful housekeepers. They are not ugly creatures either. They are just green men and women with pointy ears. They don't help around the house. They clearly wear clothes. These are obvious distinctive differences. Number 2, analyzing goblins from a cultural interpretation is absurd, as you must realize that every culture will have their own goblin variants, even outside of Europe, such as the Dokubi from Korea. And there are various yokai and Japanese folklore that could be considered similar to goblins. Native American and African folktales also tell tales of little trickster-like creatures not unlike goblins. You will find various interpretations from various sources. The different cultures reserve the right to interpret them as they see fit. It's a fantasy story. Interpreting fantasy works in a manner that is suited for its context and inspiration. This video is the equivalent of me watching One Piece and doing a video about how Zoro is a terrible swordsman because he uses katana incorrectly to how they would actually be used. Within the world he lives in the context being drawn from, and the mind of its creator, what he does is feasible. Since Goblin Slayer draws its inspiration from Tolkien style or D&D style goblins, then the interpretation is sound. And number 3. Alright, time to put on my tinfoil hat for this one, but I do have to wonder, why did you choose to pick apart Goblin Slayer? I mean, why not go after Tolkien? Why not go after D&D? Why not acknowledge the flaws in the other 2 anime outside of attractive goblins? Your hashtag not all goblins moment actually felt very familiar. And then it hit me. This feels so much like a response to public backlash. You often refer to your Goblin Slayer issue by calling it Goblin Slayer Episode 1, or the first episode of Goblin Slayer. While you dismiss the controversy, you don't address anything else about Goblin Slayer outside of the first episode. The same episode that got the media in an uproar. Much like an Islamic terrorist attack can spark anti-Islamic sentiments, a very controversial anime episode can spark very hostile or counterintuitive actions towards anime or the anime in question. In this, I think you hope to quell the outrage with this. shaming the naughty and offensive Goblin Slayer for interpreting goblins all wrong in the first place. Anime isn't bad, guys. Goblin Slayer just doesn't get goblins. That's all, right? You can still enjoy these other anime that get them much more accurately as peaceful and friendly creatures. Don't worry about that awful first episode. Not all goblins rape women and hurt people. Hashtag not all goblins. Doesn't that feel like a cringy Twitter post all of a sudden? But again, that's just my silly conspiracy theory. In short, this was not a fair assessment of Goblin Slayer or the other two anime in question. I have respect for Gaijin Goombah and know that they are capable of better than this. I won't hold this one against them because, as they said, this kind of history and culture isn't their forte. I just want them to be direct about what their intentions are. Did they really want to analyze the cultural accuracy of goblins in these three anime? If so, why bully Goblin Slayer when all three have clear flaws? Did they only want to prove that goblins are not malicious? If so, then why not analyze Tolkien and D&D as well? Did they just want to ridicule an anime that was considered controversial? If so, why not just outright say you took issue with the episode and the scenes that made it controversial? I can't say I know for certain the motivations behind this. My conspiracy theory bit there is only a guess, and I'm not entirely sure I would give it much credibility. But this is a good place to end it, I think. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.